We are now in Tier 3 of the chipped iceberg, going deep into the mystery of the life of a man who claims an invasive experiment planted a chip or series of chips to control his brain chemistry. After they removed all memories of his previous life and also removed his inner voice, emotions, dreams, memory, and imagination, hold on to your pants because things are only going to get crazier. Entering Tier 3 is vain LFO, an outrageous use of the chip people's actions. As we've learned, the chip seems to have total control of the tightness and looseness of his veins. The blood flow all over his body did a very strange thing one day when Shirk was at his house not doing very much. The chip people made those veins work in various sound waves such as sine, squares, and triangles. It didn't last very long, and it was also a good example of the scientists showing their cards, allowing Shurg, who just a few months ago had learned about the chip, to gain insight of their powers and motives. It was also one of the first times the chip was directly physically malicious. Taking direction is a good analysis of how the chip affects normal physical and cognitive abilities. Being able to recognize all the steps needed to complete something and the process of doing those things comes hard for sure. And this topic covers many different versions of directions that needed to be taken. From physical work, to equations, to memory, to small-scale crafting projects. The lack of cognitive function due to the chip puts Shurg at a major disadvantage, even after hard attempts to do the task. He claims to easily get lost by long vocal directions the most. This is another music/audio topic about how the chip has seemingly changed how sound was heard going into Shurg's ear. Shurg's main digital audio workstation of choice is Ableton Live. He has spent hundreds of hours on it. However, one time Shurg logged into Ableton and was struck by a strange happening. The compression and mastering of sounds he's used many times were more punchy and impactful. Also a little dirtier, as the sounds had less audio purity cleanness than normal. Different topics of how the chip changes audio in real time for Shurg is found later in the iceberg. HD widescreen was a very rare chip happening, only seen one time, ever. The chip gave Shurg direct vision of seeing from a view like he was in a cinema. His vision also overrode his normal eyesight, forcing him to exist in this theater for a few seconds. The edges of the vision were the only thing not in HD. Claptrap from the Borderlands games came in stage right, said one word and gestured with his hands. That was the entire transmission. However, Shurg's philosophy of time passing being okay is an interesting one. He was used to being in this mild emotional state that the chip had gave him his whole life. You could say he never experienced strong emotions very much, and so he didn't know what they felt like. But Shurg claims it's more of a feeling of not being in control, which invades almost every aspect of his life. Shurg has seen weather split in two. One side was dry and one side was rain, and there was a clear line. The second time he saw this was years later in Florida, the same state he saw the first one. It's just something that stuck out as an oddity, but in a world of supposed weather control, who can really say? Spawning again from a toxic thought process, he thinks the chip people may have the ability to do something like this. If anything, they caused the second one, but that's highly, highly unlikely. Fair Roofie is a funny story, at least if you are Shurg. On his 21st birthday, Shurg was banging Jaeger bombs in the back seat on the way to a town fair. Shurg had drank before, mostly beers and the occasional cheap wine. He'd drink high% beers warm in a cup to down them as fast as he could. Shurg was known to vomit out alcohol pretty commonly. His friend was meeting someone at the fair, and Shurg got a few beers with the drink tickets. He was handed an extra beer, which he drank half of. He told the group that he was going to go puke and handed the beer to his other friend. On the ride home, the friend was feeling the effects of the roofies placed in the beer, claiming he was going in and out of consciousness. The puke in the porta-john made the difference that day. Twinkling stars is a chip vision that happened a few times before and after the chip awakening. When he were to look up at the sky on a clear night, Shurg would often see a normal star twinkling and not staying one way. He ignored the implication of this before the chip, as he did much implications. Shurg's extremely unactive mind and the strange things that he was seeing and feeling out in the world did not make sense to Shurg. Not being able to explain this, he occasionally thought that he was being watched through his phone, GPS, or webcam. This theory never led to any serious action, but pre-chip oddities are found in this tier and later tiers. The topic umbrella of Shurg's vision played a role here, and it's pretty interesting, but it'll be later down the iceberg. When awakening into his new life, the first example of someone identifying the place he lived was an apartment that Shurg could not remember, but was given one solitary picture in his mind. Shurg was 5 years old during this. He was not sure, but it could have been just a few days after waking up in his new life. Jumping forward, one night he was staying with his family. While trying to go to sleep, Shurg had visions appear that were taking the sounds of the cars and house noises and turning them into something. What he recalled was rough to work with, but he knows he saw an impoverished, dark, rainy street in a populated city. Shurg destined himself into a scummy life and scummy behavior before the chip revealed itself. This was due to the fact, as Shurg knew it, he was not capable of making success in high talent or high competition job fields. Throughout his life, there were many things that Shurg tried and failed at. This instilled into him the notion that he was simply not smart or talented enough to compete with most people. This is an example of Shurg noticing that something was wrong with his brain's abilities before the chip revealed itself. The warmth is a formative experience for the belief that the chip was invasive and not caused by Shurg. Sometimes very unhealthy things caused this warmth. It was mostly caused by smoking too much weed, listening to emotional songs, watching a lot of media, and also putting together things in wrestling. The whole wrestling psyche thing is later in the Iceberg. It wasn't entirely self-destructive, but had led him to do some stupid things. He just wanted to feel the warmth. He felt that it was his body telling him what he wanted. He also guessed that a romantic relationship would deliver him this warmth. He now knows that this is caused by the amount of blood flow allotted in his veins by the chip. Wrestling has played a big role in Shurg's passion and is all over this Iceberg. As far as he can recall, the first wrestling he ever saw was a rerun of Raw in 2013. He believes Kane, Triple H, and Goldust were all in this episode. An interesting thing is that Raw rarely run reruns, and Shurg is pretty sure this was before the Spike TV deal. He doesn't believe this, but some evidence could link this rerun to a chip transmission. After, he went to his bedroom and thought about other wrestling champions. Without having any previous knowledge, the chip was sending him pictures of wrestlers who sort of looked like the wrestlers they were meant to be. He recalls thinking about Ric Flair and John Cena. This is an example of some of the very strange things the chip has done early in Shurg's life. The real first one is a one-off night of chipped activity that is incredibly interesting. Shurg was stalking late night at the grocery store. Early in his shift, he was listening to music in headphones. Shurg had theorized a micro-genre of music called Trump Wave. It would be made of money and power-up sounds from video games, Trump speeches, and cuts and chops of Trump campaign songs. He put on a Trump rally and listened to the songs trying to get some inspiration. For the first time ever, Shurg not only could replay sounds in his ears, but he could chop them up and remix them. This only lasted a few songs. Shurg wasn't one to ask the big questions, and would rather live life as best as he could, as he was. Along with the first internal voice ever, he also saw the first animation ever. Losing his box cutter, he thought the guy cleaning the floors took it because Shurg was always extending the razor all the way and closing the razor all the way, making a noise that his boss had complained about. He saw, for the first time ever, animations of a cartoon Shurg doing wrestling moves on a cartoon of the floor cleaner. He later wrote a song about that night. He again shied away from the big question. How could he possibly answer it? Dog drown is pretty morbid, at least for someone who isn't chipped. Shurg was playing with his dog, who his grandparents owned, throwing a tennis ball into the pond, and his dog would bring it back. After a few throws, the dog suddenly drowned and sank under the water. Shurg was pretty far away. Not like that's an excuse, but Shurg's emotional reaction was almost nothing. He says this is an example how the chip can make life seem worthless if they look at it a certain way. Everyone's life is worse is much like the night urban city fear topic, as it was a young Shurg facing a big thought with image he saw seemingly coming from nowhere. Young Shurg, late night in his bed, began to think about why his life was so great and compare it to other people in his neighborhood. He had a loving mom, a nice warm house, entertainment, a middle-class upbringing, and wasn't pressured by family or school. So, Shurg internally ran down what his friends didn't have, jumping to the opposite side of an argument with a great but few pieces of information is a common scheme the chip pulls. The topic of weed-deep thoughts is going to break down other chip schemes in the next tier. So, with one piece of new information, the chip would make Shurg think that each one of his friends had a worse life. That was the meta that happened that night. We don't talk a lot about Shurg the person, but for my time spent with him, he's a kind, lighthearted guy, especially given his situation. Addiction resistance is pretty much what the name says. From as far as he can tell, being chipped allots the ability to feel the effects of drugs less and the addiction effects much less. Shurg has been able to take drugs for weeks and stop cold turkey without any feelings of addiction. Booze, cigs, weed, Adderalls, ecstasies are all examples of this. He has quit smoking cigs, pipes, and cigarillos cold turkey with no side effects to him. He doesn't understand how the chip does this and why, but he believes this is one of the most obvious examples of chipped activity. Chipped President Game was a hypothetical game Shurg thought would go great with the chip technology. You see, at this point, it was past the phase of Shurg thinking voices of people he heard were real people. Instead, he assumed all the voices he heard were manipulations of brain chemistry via the chip. This was also nearing the end of the constant meme communications, but Shurg still heard and summoned many famous voices to keep him company. One night, he was talking to the old True Capitalist Radio Ghost voice before the new microphone. Ghost's love for Texas and Shurg's love for the Midwest got him thinking, what if there was a game where different people act like nations and peoples and try to do things like diplomacy and trade? It was never put to paper because he didn't have the people to run the countries and he didn't know all the ways to run a country. The terrible things done is the last topic in this episode, and it's yet another one with a large scope. You can do some terrible things and not realize you did it, or why you did it. When Shurg thinks back, he thinks about the consequences of thousands of messages in action. Most of these actions, Shurg doesn't remember what he did or why he did it, and he believes this comes with a high consequence. He was lucky enough that his social awkwardness wasn't followed with bullying and ridicule, which leads him to think what would happen if he was met with hostility. He believes mental and physical self-harm may have occurred. Although generally he was pretty nice to new kids in the socially strange, he had a few times where he joined in on bullying or ostracized people he didn't like because of their personalities. Big Chip, he attributed his actions to the love of shit-talking and making jokes. He believed that if certain social pressures were to occur, the chip may have changed its tactics. This being one of the few times in his life that a minor change would majorly affect the way the chip experiment would go. He also believes if he were to get pushed to such a point that he was suicidal, the chip may have revealed itself earlier to save its life. That was Tier 3 Part 1. Part 2 is going to come out in at least 2 weeks because I'm going to be busy. Thank you for watching, everybody.